It does show the sort of strain that the market is under this winter.
It's very rare to hear the chief economist of the Bank of England being so frank about Brexit.
I think that what's more problematic for policy in the UK is following these basics so that people make decisions on the basis of the full picture.
Stephen, I would like to have a small rant.
Oh, just a small one. That's a relief.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. As promised, today we're going to be looking in detail at what the Bank of England decided, but also what it means for politicians as we look towards 2024. First of all, the headlines in the Bank of England. Lizzy, you are here to judge me on this because this is the main part of your job, and I feel like you do a much better job than me, but here we go. So rates stayed unchanged at a 15-year high. Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, says there's, quote, still some way to go in the fight to control inflation. So no rate cuts on the horizons, despite what the markets think, by the way. And the new Bank of England economic forecast actually gloomier than it was before. Bank of England now expects growth to be flat in the fourth quarter of 2023. Did I miss anything?
Well, I think we could talk about what it means for politics, because if you are sitting in Westminster, you would probably be pretty disappointed that the rate cuts aren't going to come until way later next year, or to be told that they're not even being discussed yet at the Bank of England. And for growth to be gloomier, this isn't great news for Rishi Sunak, given that it was one of his top 5 priorities at the start of the year for that to be, for the economy to be growing.
But if rate cuts do magically fall in, let's say, the middle of next year, is that not a good sign for voters going to the polls, let's say, for example, in the autumn?
Well, it might change when Rishi Sunak wants to call the general election to not have so many people remortgaging on these higher rates. But I am told that this is not factoring in and that we really shouldn't be thinking about a spring election anyway.
The really interesting thing is to put this in a bit of global context. In case anybody's missed it, there's been what they've been dubbing a pivot party. The Federal Reserve signalling that it is going to cut rates at some point next year. Markets have really taken off this week. The Bank of England, though, and the ECB both really pushing back on when rate cuts are going to happen. Interesting in the readout written by our friend Julian Harris, the newsletter there, saying that Christine Lagarde and Andrew Bailey are standing grumpily in the corner, refusing to drink the punch.
Stop looking at me when you say that.
Well, Jay Powell brought everyone around, and then they said...
Yes, it was a big round.
Not for me, thanks. Yeah. Okay, joining us to shed some light and potentially some also analysis of what happened in yesterday's policy committee announcement is our senior economics reporter, Philip Aldrick. Phil, great to have you in with us. So, what did you make then of the Bank of England decision yesterday? Is this the thing that we have to not think about rates coming down yet, or can we start to get excited about this happening?
Yeah, I don't think we can start thinking about rate cuts imminently. I mean, the bank is pretty clear. All the messaging has been it's too early to start thinking about rate cuts. 3 members of the 9-strong committee voted for a rate hike, so they want interest rates to be 5.5%. So the signalling is very much the other side of the equation, which is we haven't got on top of inflation yet. So market boys and girls, just hold your horses.
And we also had some new economic data today showing that consumer confidence is rebounding. Are we meant to take away that the public is just blissfully unaware of an impending recession?
Well, the business activity of the PMIs is also quite positive. So, is there going to be a recession? That's the question. I mean, the Bank of England is not forecasting a recession. The OBR is not forecasting a recession.
Stagnation, recession, tomato.
I mean, it's basically zero growth, right? So I think the question for households is everything's relative, right? If you had a really difficult year the year before, and now so you had your personal income effectively falling. And next year you're going to have a little bit of an increase over as inflation comes down and your pay rises is coming through and your energy bills are falling, etc. There'll be this. You'll feel a little bit more confident, and this is probably that reflecting that we've come from a pretty dismal place to a slightly less dismal place, and that is a big improvement. Although no one's jumping for joy, but. Yeah, coming through.
As you mentioned, the PMIs just out in the last couple of hours were really quite decent, weren't they? And certainly a lot better than France's and Germany's we had this morning, which were really quite poor, weren't they?
Well, everyone's in contraction. It's not like one except for the services reading in the UK.
And the broader picture, the composite was
positive
in growth as well. Just looking at the autumn statement and the impact that's had on the Bank of England, what do you make of the BOE's projections on what the autumn statement is going to do to the public finances and the economy?
So, I mean, they're saying that the bank said that they would increase their growth forecast slightly, but they also said it's not actually going to have any impact on inflation. So it's better for growth, but it doesn't change the inflation outlook.
How does that work? Just this is really 101, but how do you not boost inflation with your tax cuts and yet manage to grow the economy?
Well, it's so you have to think of the economy as having two sides, and if one side accelerates, so if demand accelerates faster than supply, you have an inflationary impulse. If supply rises and demand rises in tandem, the impact on prices doesn't change. So because they've basically got the same balance, net balance, that's how they explain it. But it's good for the public finances, although to be honest, it doesn't really matter what the Bank of England thinks on this stuff, because it's the OBR that will determine what it means for whether Hunt has an extra 10 billion or whatever for tax cuts. And the OBR's forecast was already a little bit more optimistic than the Bank of England, so the Bank of England is moving more in line, and the OBR did incorporate all of these tax, the autumn statement changes into its forecast. So the good news here actually is that the market has been adjusting as a result of what's happening in America, as you were talking about with Jay Powell basically signaling that there could be discussion of rate cuts, etc. So global markets have been shifting now and effectively bringing down long-term borrowing costs, and that's happening in the UK as well. And that is probably going to give Hunt some headroom, but that's not anything to do with what the bank is doing. That's just these global forces.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that actually. Do you think, looking into 2024, if the Fed does start cutting rates sort of fairly early in the year, other central banks in Europe, the UK and the ECB, are they going to be able to hold the line and stick to this, oh no, we're not cutting rates thing, or are they going to get pushed into following the Fed?
Markets just listen to Jay Powell. They don't even care what Andrew Bailey's saying, it seems.
Yeah, well, the power of the dollar is enormous, and so markets here are basically being driven by what's happening in America to a large degree, and the bank cannot push back against that beyond ramping of interest rates up to such a degree it's unnecessary. The sort of whether the UK and the ECB can hold the line and say we're not going to cut rates if the Fed is cutting rates, in theory we do have an inflation problem here still. We have underlying services inflation, which is at 6.6%. We have wages growing at over 7%. So we do have domestic inflationary problems, for which the Bank of England, this is why they aren't saying we're talking about cutting rates. But if next year the Fed starts cutting rates, you're going to get loads of politicians coming out telling the bank that why isn't it following course and cutting rates? And the last thing the bank is then going to want to do is find itself looking like it's responding to Jacob Rees-Mogg saying we need to cut rates. So I imagine they'll want to kind of get ahead of the game and they'll rather than look like they're having to respond to political pressure.
But similarly with Donald Trump and Jay Powell.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a really interesting question because it sort of speaks to the difficult position that central banks find themselves in, because ultimately for voters, or for example people who have mortgages, they're still going to be paying higher interest rates, and until rates start to come down, there's still going to be people going to be paying out more money on their mortgages every month. And is that what's going to affect that conversation you were talking about earlier about who feels better off and how short is your memory versus do you remember how well off you felt 2 years ago versus how well you felt off a year ago versus how well off you're going to feel when you go to vote at some point next year, as we expect it to be. How difficult does it become for the central bank to be able to operate above all of that and not even be seen to be bowing to pressure from politicians who, of course, will want some good news going into an election?
Yeah, it does get tricky, doesn't it? Because if the bank starts cutting rates just ahead of an election, it's people are going to start crying, foul. Like what's going on here? So I guess there is a sort of coordination risk for the perception of bank independence. So far, the bank's rate rises and the policy that they're taking on quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, is actually giving Jeremy Hunt a massive headache. So you would definitely say that they are really separating themselves from the fiscal side of the economy, and if that means that it's creating a problem for the Chancellor, they don't seem to care. And in that respect, you would say that at the moment that would suggest that they will continue to toe that line. Of course, when in the teeth of an election, they don't want to end up becoming this kind of political creature, because just by the simple fact that their policy is having this enormous, interest rates are both redistributive, and any interest rate decision is redistributive. People who have cuts are bad for the wealthy. Tax rises, rate rises are good for the wealthy and bad for people who are borrowing. So you can't avoid that there is some politics mixed up in what is supposed to be an apolitical Bank of England.
And that's why we're talking about the Bank of England on the UK Politics podcast. Phil Aldrick, our senior economics reporter, thanks for being with us in the studio.
Well, let's get another view now on that Bank of England rate decision. Tony Yates is a former senior advisor at the central bank, and he's been writing in the FT about the report by the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee on the bank's independence. We spoke to him earlier about this, but we started by asking him what he made of the vote split in yesterday's rate decision.
I was kind of surprised that 3 members in the UK actually wanted to raise rates. So how to make sense of that? Well, I mean, all of the central banks that moved are focused on what they're thinking of as domestically generated inflation measures like services or even just wages. But the signals in all economies are relatively similar, and yet the decisions are pretty different. So I thought that the UK's response was relatively hawkish, perhaps reflecting the bank's fairly miserable outlook for potential output. And if you can contrast that with what Powell was reflecting on, he was talking about the help that the US had got from what he described as a participation shock, a kind of reversal of the fall in participation, preceding and during the pandemic. But we haven't got that in the UK.
Does this reflect on the BOE's credibility that markets are evidently listening more to Jerome Powell than to Andrew Bailey?
I don't think so. I mean, there are enough differences in the circumstances in the individual economies, I think, to justify taking individual decisions. The Fed is not, there is not a global currency area. They're not presiding over identical sets of news. I think it will actually be good. It will force them to explain themselves a bit more closely. So, it'd be interesting to see how they deal with that in the next 2 or 3 months.
I mean, you've been writing about this report by the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee, which, of course, the former Bank of England Governor Mervyn King chairs. It warned that when public confidence in the Bank of England is so low, independence could be at risk. I wonder if you think that's going too far when, given that expectation management is the Bank of England's job and confidence is crucial to that, maybe the Lords are right.
I mean, the major risk that the Lords were reflecting on, which I think it was right for them to do that, is the fact that inflation went up to 11.1, which is extraordinary, given that the target is 2. But I think really that was a reflection of the extraordinary circumstances that we found ourselves in. We had Brexit, the throttling of supply chains by the post-pandemic period, and then we had the massive increases in food and energy costs caused by the war in Ukraine. So these are 3 colossal supply shocks, and it was probably, although the bank I don't think planned it, it was probably roughly the right thing to do. So I think it is definitely going too far to think that independence is threatened. It's right always to worry about it. But I think the bank has come out of it, reasonably well, given how the difficult circumstances it faced. So this issue now about exactly when it should cut, I think, is or indeed even if it will cut in the next few months, is concerning, because we don't want the bank to overdo it. We don't want an inflation target undershoot. But really, the bigger picture is we've survived a massive surge in inflation, and it's coming down, and that's cause for celebrations. If I was the governor, that's the kind of thing I'll be focusing on. I think is to step back a bit and not worry about exactly the fine detail of the trajectory back to lower rates, but to think about the fact that we've just survived this enormous surge in inflation, and it is coming back to target.
But are politicians doing enough to reflect that? I mean, there is criticism of the BOE in this House of Lords Economic Committee's report. We've had a variety of commentary out of the politicians in the government over the past year and a half or so about the Bank of England. Given that it's a very difficult task, as you outlined, are politicians making the Bank of England's job more difficult?
I think they are. I mean, we had a summer when the Tories were trying to sort out who was going to be their leader, and there were rumbles from the Truss camp that the bank had fallen asleep at the wheel and needed sorting out. And then when it was eventually resolved after the Truss Kwarteng budget and Sunak took over, it was very unhelpful of him to list halving inflation as one of his 5 pledges, because that just injects confusion about whose job it is to pull inflation down and who's actually responsible. So I think that was really unhelpful.
Well, that was the former Bank of England senior advisor Tony Yates speaking to us a little bit earlier. Lizzy, I wonder what you thought of that idea of this, getting in on the Bank of England's credibility by politicians having many opinions on them.
Well, I think central bankers sometimes act like politicians. You have them telling you how much you should ask for in your pay rise and telling firms how much they should take in profit. I think these roles often blur the lines.
Yeah, I thought Phil made a really interesting point, is that changing interest rates is actually quite a politically charged thing. And if you put up interest rates rapidly, as they have done over the past couple of years, that's very useful for people who have a lot of savings, particularly older people, older voters. And it's bad for those with lots of debts, generally people, sort of middle-aged people with mortgages. So it is a very political business, although they might
even if that's not the goal, of course.
No, indeed.
Yeah. Right, OK, let's turn next to a Bloomberg scoop. The government considering a crackdown on social media access for children under 16, including potential bans. Our tech reporter Tom Seo was part of the team that broke that story. He's with us now. Tom, what exactly is the government thinking about here?
Hi, it's really early stages, and we were told they are going to hopefully launch a consultation in the new year to explore. They think there's not enough research on this topic, the potential harms, the excessiveness of it. So it'll be informed by that. But, you have a sort of question in mind when you launch a consultation like that.
Tom, this sounds like telling everyone you're going to stop the boats. Is it actually realistic to tell teenagers they can't go on social media, or is it just flag flying aimed at winning votes from frustrated parents?
Yeah, stop the phones. I think it's a bit of both. It's not completely without some backing. They passed the Online Safety Act this year, just a couple of months ago, which is quite a groundbreaking piece of legislation. And so, on the one hand, this does set the direction of travel, which Labour can choose to pick up or discard, given where the polls are going. That's really how it might pan out, because this government doesn't have enough time to sort of move this sort of thing into legislation. That said, I think it will be very popular with a certain segment of the population, with parents. I think a lot of people think that their kids are addicted to their phones, and it's not necessarily a good thing.
Slightly feels like the government's trying to do something which every parent in the country has been attempting to do over the past few years and failing. This is going to involve big tech companies, isn't it? Some of the biggest companies in the world. Has the UK got any chance of getting its way in this?
I think when it comes to potential bans, then it gets a bit more extreme. But there are things that you could see companies doing. I think parental controls could be beefed up, theoretically. I think TikTok has a parental pairing option where you can kind of see what your kid is looking at and sort of restrict it. So I could theoretically see something like that being more widely adopted.
Has any other country actually managed to do something similar?
Well, I've not done a global survey, but the only one that comes to mind is China, which has given children sort of daily screen time limits on their version of TikTok. So that comparison was drawn when our story broke yesterday, but probably not one that Rishi Sunak was hoping for.
And this comes as the National Crime Agency's issued a warning to parents about social media. Just break down what they said for us, Tom.
Yeah, this is part of something that the UK government has been saying quite widely, which is there is a risk that is not necessarily being managed about encrypted messaging, and it lets bad people do bad things and keep them hidden. And Meta is rolling out encryption more widely across its services. WhatsApps are encrypted. I believe now they're rolling it out to Facebook Messenger, the other main messaging service they run. Home secretaries for several years now have been saying that this is dangerous, and the Online Safety Act sets out kind of preliminary question about companies having to do something about this. And if Ofcom, the regulator, is not down the road, so this is not imminent, but if it's not satisfied that companies are doing enough, then it could act. It could ask them to, implement new technology which no one necessarily knows what that would be, by the way.
Tom, has this rather come out of the blue? Because the Online Safety Act was debated endlessly, wasn't it? It was a piece of legislation which took a long time to go through Parliament, and now we seem to be kind of adding extra bits to it.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. I think the way that one of my sources put it to me was that, well, the Online Safety Act took 6 years from sort of conception all the way through to becoming legislation recently, and it evolved and it had lots of amendments and it grew, and by the time that it got to the end, things have already moved on again, and so you kind of have to keep on addressing this issue and sort of keep on moving it forward.
Tom, it seems like a fairly lofty goal, and you've talked us through some of the ideas of how it's early consultations, but it does make you wonder how much are perhaps the government being a bit too ambitious about their potential influence over tech companies and indeed over teenagers.
Well, they now do have the Online Safety Act as a wedge in to kind of ask companies to do things to keep children safe. And that was always the original goal of the Online Safety Act, by the way. It was really aimed at sort of protecting children online. And their slogan is "Make the UK the safest place in the world to be online." So it's all kind of new, and it does seem unrealistic, doesn't it, when we think about how much sway tech companies have these days. So that's why it's such a fascinating story. I'm afraid I can't tell you which way it's going to pan out.
Tom, I say they should send all the naughty teenagers to Rwanda. Thanks for bringing us that story. That's our tech reporter, Thomas Seal, who broke the story. Great to have you on, Tom.
Well, let's think ahead about some of the stories in the political world this week. You've been very distracted by central banks and by the economic situation, but perhaps a more immediate challenge facing the government. Another by-election, which, as we know, Yuan, is your favourite topic of conversation.
Another possible by-election. Tory MP Scott Benton faces being suspended from Parliament for 35 days over a very serious breach of standard rules. Those are the words used in the report. It was by Parliament's Standards Committee. They said he'd given the message that he was, quote, corrupt and for sale. Pretty strong words. In a newspaper sting reporters posing as gambling industry investors, he offered to lobby ministers and table parliamentary questions. Writing to the committee, Scott Benton said that I do not consider my actions to be a breach. He says he complied with the letter and the spirit of the rules. Now, the sanctions still need to be voted on by MPs, and then if passed, there would need to be a recall petition among voters. And remember that 10% is the threshold for a by-election to be called. But we've seen that being met many times in the past.
So, what's going to happen? Don't keep us in suspense.
Well, Blackpool South is pretty marginal. It's certainly a much easier target for Labour than the likes of Tamworth or Selby. It's the less posh end of Blackpool. I think I can possibly say that. Steve's giving me a very dirty look.
You always call me a snob.
I didn't say it wasn't nice. I just said it was the less posh end of Blackpool.
More affordable.
Yes, more affordable. Yes, indeed. And it's a seat that the Tories took from Labour at the last election. It was one of those 2019 wins with a majority of less than 4,000. So I think probably fairly you could describe it as a seat in the red wall. But it's not one of those seats which the Tories have never held before. But it has mostly been held by Labour over the last couple of decades. To get it back from the Tories, Keir Starmer would need a swing of 5.5%. So that is not a big swing. Put it in a bit of context. Labour managed a 21% swing in Mid-Bed, so that was pretty stonking. 24% in Tamworth. So yeah, a 5.5% swing. Keir Starmer, I think, will be looking this one over with a little bit of relish.
Indeed. Well, plenty to look forward to if we do get that by-election after all of those procedural hurdles have been surmounted as well. Plenty to look forward to in the next week. It might be wrapping towards Christmas for most people, but actually we've still got a couple of days of parliamentary business to be had, although of course we don't have another Prime Minister's Questions next week because Tuesday will be the last day for Parliament before recess as well, and lots to watch out for in terms of the economic data, if such things are of interest to you as well. We've got the latest inflation figures out next week. Who will that give cause for celebration or commiseration to? And
don't forget that Rishi Sunak's going to be jetting off to Italy for talks about the illegal immigration headache. He's going to meet his opposite number there, Giorgia Meloni, and I think Elon Musk is due to speak at that festival as well. So plenty to discuss with his old buddy Elon. Of course, was the headline act at the AI Summit.
Indeed. Well, that is it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and James Wilcock. I'm Yuan Potts.
I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.